Hi there, welcome back. This is English 122, Pikes Peak Community College Online section. This is week 11. We're almost finished with our journey this semester. I wanted to catch up on a few, I guess they call them housekeeping details, and then I'll go into the discussion for this week. The discussion information this week is on complicating your thesis. Complicating the thesis is a specific way to add tension, one way to think about your thesis and how to make it extended, especially for an extended research argument. Sometimes you run out of places to go with it. So we want to look at how you can add that tension and complication, complexity, depth to it, so that you can extend and have an extended researched argument that is sufficient to be a synthesis paper to integrate several voices and then have that impactful so what that we've been looking for. But we're also going to be talking a little bit about counter argument. That goes hand in hand with complicating your thesis. And we'll get to that in a minute. But first I wanted to talk to you about this week, Thanksgiving week. I wanted to make sure that you had ample time to spend time with your friends and family, however you are engaging with them. Hopefully you'll get to see them in person if it's healthy to do so. If not, I hope you get some FaceTime with your family or just get a chance to spend time relaxing and enjoying the peace of the week. I don't want you to stress, and so we don't have any discussion posts, no readings for this week. I really want you to relax in, catch your breath, especially it's going into finals week. And I know that most of you are working full time. A lot of you have children or caretaking responsibilities, and going to school on top of it is a huge commitment, a huge amount. I wanted to celebrate you for that. I'm sorry I didn't say this sooner in the semester, but I really admire you for going through this journey. Online education is a wonderful tool in terms of time. It allows you to adjust your schedule and start working towards your educational goals. Uh, but it's really hard at the end of a week when you're tired and you really just want to relax, catch your breath before you start another week of school and work and trying to balance everything. It's very difficult, and I really admire you for continuing this journey. It's very difficult to go to school and to work and have all those other commitments, families, friends, however those commitments look. But it's really important that you continue your journey for yourselves, your passion. It's a commitment that your family makes along with you, but it's also so much for you, and I hope you get to really celebrate your dedication to your own path, your own journey. It's important, and I celebrate you for that. I also wanted to move into the second portion about I realized the grade books. I had thought that the basic argument that I had posted, the responses back and the grades, Ashley, thank goodness, told me that that was not the case, that it didn't come out correctly. So I have gotten those grades inputted. Your feedback papers are up back on D2L with the comments. I'm so sorry. I wish that I had been paying more attention to how that laid out, but apparently there was a glitch on my end. I did not save the information correctly. So that is now updated on the gradebook. I will have your rhetorical analyses, your critical analyses. Those grades will be done at the beginning of this week in the next couple of days. So you will be all up to date. I'll have the discussion post will be finished up as well. But everything looks great. Your writing is good. Your discussions are really wonderful. My gosh, you guys have formed a wonderful community, and that's something to celebrate as well. It's not very easy to do in an online course, but I love how engaged and kind you are to each other. You're very supportive, and your posts have been thorough, really thoughtful and thorough, not just simple answers to get the getter done, as they say. You've really taken advantage of the opportunity to have discussions with each other, and for that I applaud you as well. I will have a peer review session set up. We can do a peer review however you prefer. If you'd like to do a one-on-one Zoom meeting with somebody, I can arrange that. Or if you'd like to do what I've done in the past on online classes, if you want to have a peer review for your paper draft, send me an email and then I'll partner you up with someone else and you can exchange papers that way. I'll make sure that if I'm the conduit for that, that way you protect your email identity. So I'll make sure that I just forward your information on without revealing your email address. But I want to make sure you have the opportunity to do a peer review if you'd like. If you have some questions about even just your thesis or your so what, shoot me an email or we can do the full-on peer review, however works best for you. But it's really important to get another set of eyes, especially on your thesis. The thesis is the thing that shapes and drives your whole paper. It starts the bridge to your so what, and I hope that by now you see that the thesis is what begins the process towards the so what, and they are joined. They should join. They shouldn't be one to the other or irrelevant, or one is coincidentally connected to another. They should align, so you need to think about that so what as the end result of your thesis is the so what. The so what is the nugget that really shapes and drives your project. And what I want you to think about too when you're starting to work on revising your papers, the easiest thing to start revising is your thesis itself and your so what. Sometimes it seems counterintuitive to do that. You want to go into the nuts and bolts. In your comments, in the paper comments I've made to you, things like transitions are easily fixed. Evidence is easily handled. Those sometimes it's just changing a comma. But trying to get a thesis that's worthy and supportable throughout your whole extended research can be difficult, and sometimes it just takes somebody else saying, did you consider this aspect? And then you fold that in, that you complicate or add that tension to a thesis. Another way to think about a thesis for complication purposes, to extend it out to the length of this paper, is to think about a thesis doesn't have to just be one sentence. It can be a whole paragraph long. And a so what doesn't have to be just one sentence at the end of your paper. It can also be a whole series of things that need to be addressed and attended to by your audience. It can be several sentences long. There are other strategies, and we'll talk about this especially with the revision and editing lecture next week. But what I think about when I'm doing a final revision and editing is I read my paper out loud and I put on a false accent. I talk like Honey Boo Boo from the Deep South. And the reason why I do that is so that I can hear, even though I am putting on this exaggerated performance of what I'm reading, when I do that, I can hear exactly what I have written versus what I think I have written. Because when I'm reading my paper quietly to myself, silently, I only see after a while what I think I see, what I think I should have on there. And I don't catch the things that are actually on there that need to be attended to and revised. So that's one strategy. A lot of people just say read your paper out loud or ask another set of eyes to read it. Ask them to see if it makes sense in terms of, does it flow from point to point? Is there something that you understand me asking you to do at the end of the paper? And can you identify what I'm arguing? You don't have to give them the technical terms. A lot of people roll their eyes when you say, can you tell me what my thesis is? They're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to talk about it. But if you just ask them, can you tell me just basically, if you read this intro, what is my argument? And then they should be able to help you out identifying those areas that need attention. Another strategy, and we'll talk about this more next week as well, in revision is if you're just really struggling with that intro paragraph, it's not working well, generally by the end of the paper, as you're building up momentum towards the so what, generally your so what can be reversed to be your working thesis, and you can flip-flop your conclusion paragraph become your intro paragraph, and then you would rewrite another conclusion paragraph. Sometimes that just switching it out makes it so much more solid and sensible, because sometimes your so what is really your thesis, and what you thought would be your thesis has changed so much over the course of your paper that you need to just rewrite a new conclusion and come up with a new so what based on what you've done. We'll talk about that more next week, but this week I wanted to talk about the excuse me, complicating the thesis and counter arguments. Complicating the thesis is when you talk about how are you going to add depth and tension to your thesis so that you give some sense of argument, not just something that somebody can say, okay, and then walk away from. Like, okay, I see, okay. You want them to really think about what you're arguing. So you want to think about questions like, is there any evidence that argues against my thesis that I haven't thought about before, that I can put in or that I can imagine? And then if you come up with some of that evidence, just note it on the side and figure out how you're going to integrate that in. Another question you can ask is there an outside source that addresses this thesis in some way? So not that this person is their argument is exactly my argument or their idea agrees with mine, but why? Why does it agree? What is the point of contact? And then another way to think about that complication is not just identifying that outside source is, but what are things that are hidden or implied, but not revealed or overt in an argument or as you're developing your thesis? Are there things that you haven't stated that either need to be thought about and accounted for in some way, or that you just know are there that you can then kind of work around without having to spend the time to argue it out? And I'll give you examples of what I mean by that. But the emphasis on a thesis, especially an extended argument thesis, the length of this paper and longer as you go through your college career, the emphasis is to develop a problem to explore versus a statement to prove. I want to say that again so you really can chew on that idea. Developing a problem to explore, so develop it out. That's why you look at joining a conversation about a topic or a problem where you take a position that will then ask your reader to do something. So you're developing that problem to explore within the body of your paper and then beyond. You're telling your reader, join this conversation yourself and take this to the next level of conversation. Versus proving a statement. A statement doesn't really have a lot of depth or tension. You can prove something through facts or data, but when you're looking at a thesis, an arguable topic, you are looking for those moments of defensibility, arguability, something that has tension and meat to it, teeth to it. It can be thin at first and then you broaden it out, deepen it, add more tension, or add more complication to it. When you're thinking about a thesis, and this information I got off of NYU's website, New York University's website from their writing program, because I think it summarizes what complicating a thesis means. Sometimes you'll hear these phrases that are used, and I used to hear this all the time when I was up at CU Boulder, and one of my colleagues in my classes kept telling her students, complicate your thesis, complicate. And I said to her, what do you mean by that? I have no idea what that looks like, what that even means. She goes, add complicated. I'm like, oh, well, there, that solved it. But what I really wanted to find out is, how do you do what she's asking you to do? If you are her student, how do you complicate that thesis? I can imagine what she wants, but how do you do that? And I found that this website at NYU's Writing Center is pretty effective at giving you some strategies for that. So their first thing that they say is, you want to think about a thesis. It's more than a statement of fact, what we're talking about, the provability versus the exploring a problem. It's a debatable claim with counterarguments. So even if you don't identify all the counterarguments, be aware that there will be counterarguments to your thesis. And I'll give you an example in just a moment what we're talking about. Second thing they say is that a thesis raises an intellectual question or a problem, something that requires thought and not just, oh, I can understand that problem because I'm a human, I can think in those ways. We're talking about an intellectual engagement where you're really spending time using all those, exercises of intellect. You want to think about, for example, the example they gave is if you're arguing something about body image comes from, say, social media worship. That's an example they give as a fairly thin thesis statement. So body image dysmorphia, or so poor body image comes from worshiping social media. And the example that might come to mind would be one of the Kardashians, for example. Not to be disrespectful to them, but you know what we're talking about with the Kardashians and the way they put their bodies as perfect images out there. So uh, that particular thesis as it is, how do you complicate it? Where do you go from it? How do you add tension to it? It's like, okay, I see that body image might be from social media worship. Well, a counter argument could be, what if you don't have access to social media at all and you still have problems with body image, with eating disorder behavior. Excuse me, I have to plug in my computer battery. Oh, I'm so sorry. So another way to think about that kind of thesis is you could add complexity by thinking about, for example, how cultural values inform those emotions that then cause that effect. So thinking about cause and effect from a thesis is one of the ways you can complicate a thesis, not just the effect of the problem, but the cause of the problem. So for example, in that example about body image and social media, they're talking about how cultural values inform our emotions. That's more particular argument. And then you can use examples of body image dysmorphia or social media, those kind of things. The third thing they talk about in thesis is you want to look at the precision of the definition and terms that you use. So for example, if you're using a term like body image, you might want to explicitly say, this is what I am understanding body image to be. This is how I'm using this term. You can use a dictionary. Dictionary.com gives you basic ideas, Webster's and stuff. Oxford English Dictionary is a subscription that Pikes Peak Community College purchased, and it's one of the strongest ways to use definitions because it shows etymology, which is the trajectory of a word, the history of that word in use. So you can see how it's changed over time, but it gives you multiple ways to understand how that word is used, and it gives you a really nice way to fill out if you're going to use definition as one of your sources in your project. It gives you ways to really understand and articulate not just how that word is used currently, but how it's been changed over time. And that trajectory might help you add tension to your thesis. The fourth thing they talk about in complicating a thesis is you want to look at tension within that problem you've identified that points to hidden claims, things that are covert, the things that we're talking about that are not obvious. So for example, what is underneath, what is unknown in that problem? So that body image example that we were working with, body image anxiety. The anxiety is the cultural tradition of anxiety, is the unknown. Is there a cultural tradition of anxiety that is causing worry, anxiety about body image because of social media? So social media becomes the trigger for that anxiety. So that takes you into another area. So it's almost like adding a cul-de-sac that you can explore further in your thesis. So that's just an example about exploring the culture, the cultural values. And then when you set up that exploring that cultural values within those theses, as you've complicated it, it leads to a so what that really addresses the thing that you added complication to, not where you started your thesis. So if I started the thesis talking about social media and body image, and then I added the complication about cultural values, and then another complication about anxiety, then my so what might be, what are we doing as a culture to understand anxiety and not to have that represented in our social media? And that might be a way to think about it. So what I hope you see in that example is that trajectory where you start from a working thesis, and it can be very thin at first, and then you keep pushing at it and adding and adding and adding, and as you add more voices and more ideas to it, you end up with a thesis that is complicated, leading toward your so what. So another thing I want to think about, they talk about with thesis, is that it implies your argument's structure. So as you come up with your working thesis and then you add that complexity and depth to it, if you revise that thesis to include that tension that you've added, the depth and the complication you've added to it, then what you should see is that your implied structure for your argument is already unfolded. And that's what we talk about, the thesis points. Your thesis points structure your body paragraphs. And you should start being able to see a coherent linking going on. They want to talk about as well that there are room to explore counter-arguments. That's the other portion of this evening's discussion. Counter-arguments are ways to say, somebody else is saying, obviously, when I say X, you say Y. And then how do you negotiate that space? How do you mediate that conversation so that you either double down on what you say? I say X, you say Y, but I really say X. Or you say, I say X, you say Y, therefore I say Z. And you've changed it based on that counter argument. So you can include a counter argument and say, after consideration of this aspect, perhaps we need to look at, instead of anxiety as the cultural value that we're looking at, maybe we're looking at the concept of aesthetics rather than anxiety. What kind of aesthetics are we looking for in humans, or what do we understand about body image itself? Who is the voyeur looking at the image? And then you want to think about, within that counter argument, is there something that you need to say where I say X, you say Y, so I say Y as well, where you've completely turned your argument. You want to explain why you have decided that that counter argument has enough power to turn your argument. And it's important to say, I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater if you're going to take that tactic, but really understand why you're changing the counter argument, and to embrace that counter argument, and then complicate that down to your so what. And then finally, the last thing you want to talk about is you want to show somehow in your complicating your thesis that there is a clear reason for your claims, that it's not absolute, but that there really is a causal link. Again, cause and effect. You're really looking for that cause. What is the link that makes me come up with this argument that is not, that's not apparent right off the bat, but I see a clear reason for my claims once I've identified my general argument that I'm trying to, the problem I'm tackling. So thinking about all those things when you're writing your papers, let me know if you have any questions, especially about counterarguments. But complicating your thesis, once you see a really good complicated thesis, you're like, oh, I see. So I put up an example of a really well-written synthesis argument. It was for English 121, so it's a little shorter than our assignment, and it only has 4 sources versus the 5 that we asked for in this paper, but it's well written. It's got a really good complicated thesis, and this author has developed it over the course of the paper and turned it and played with it and given all those depth that we look for. It has that spectacular title that we look for. So I wanted to show you that example. And then I'm going to give you one last example of a working thesis that that is complicated. And this is talking about a paper I was working on talking about Charles Dickens in A Christmas Carol, where he commodifies Christmas. He makes it a commodity versus celebrating the Christian ideals or religion in that text. And so what I've come up with the initial thesis is several lines long, and I'll post this up on our website for your example. But the end complexity is I'm looking at economic and sociological studies suggest that the family unit was based on the commodification of people, vastly different from the nostalgic view of family first and Christian ideals that Charles Dickens and 21st century Western culture constructs. So essentially, human capital replaced Christian family values as the defining cultural identity of Victorian London in the mid 19th century. And so that particular thesis, what I'm looking at is adding the complication of how do we understand what family looks like in the 21st century and back in the 19th century? How do we understand how Charles Dickens works with his characterization, looking at Christian ideals, we're looking at Marxism, we're looking at capitalism, all these things are folded into this thesis. But the thing that drives that thesis, and I want you to think about this in your own work, is the thing that will drive your thesis to set it up on the T-ball stand for your reader is strong contextual information. It has to be particular. Don't go from the history of time because it's too much. You can't argue that from the history of time. You have to argue this place, this when, this where, these players, this idea, this text. Be specific, be really specific in your culture, in your context, so that you can set up that thesis that is manageable and you can add complication to. Otherwise, you have too much to tackle and your thesis will be thin. So that's all I have to say this week. I'm sorry I'm always long, but I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving and enjoy your time with your family and friends.